Good evening for those who are arriving. Good evening. My name is Kevin McGruder. I'm an associate professor of history at Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. And this evening, I'm going to give a brief discussion of my new book, which is called Philip Payton, the Father of Black Harlem. And I want to try to use the first half of our time to just discuss the book and then leave the second half for any questions that you might have. So I'm going to share my screen because I have some slides I'd like to take us through. In just a minute. Okay, and so this is the cover of the book. It's published by Columbia University Press, and it came out in July of this year. And it looks at the life of Philip Anthony Payton Jr., who was born in 1876 and died in 1917. And one of the ways that I think about what he did is he branded Harlem for Black people as a Black community before there were any substantial numbers of Black people there. He was born in Westfield, Massachusetts, and his father was a barber. His mother had a hairdressing business. The picture on the right shows the family building, which is just behind that tree there. And his parents were an entrepreneurial team that throughout the 1880s, 1890s, city directors of Westfield, Massachusetts, where they lived, had advertisements about their business. Peyton was his family was quite ambitious, but he describes his own youth as not being particularly noteworthy. He was sent to Livingstone College for a year when his junior year in high school because he was falling in with the wrong crowd.
Wow.
And the year there, yes.
70.
And that was at a time when Black colleges, as you might know, had high school and college kind of programs because they wanted to create a feeder for their colleges. So he spent a year at Livingston. J.C. Price, who was the president of Livingston, was good friends with his father.
All right.
So that's really the connection. After a year there,
I remember this. I just Livingston.
Yeah, I guess his behavior improved, so he was able to come home. But when he came home, he played football, and this is the early years of football. He had a football injury, and it was he broke his wrist, and he never returned to high school. So he was a high school dropout, and he ended up working in his father's barbershop. Meanwhile, his younger brother, James, who was a year younger than him, was at Yale. And this is James's graduation photograph. He was scheduled to graduate in 1900, the spring of 1900. The previous year, I think probably with that graduation in mind, Peyton he even says that he decided he wasn't getting any younger. If he was going to do something, he better do it. So he moved to New York in 1899. And like most Black men, had a series of menial jobs. And then he managed to get a job as a porter in a real estate office of a man who was a white man who was one of the developers of the Upper West Side. And in this office, that's where he gets the idea to go into real estate. And he forms a partnership with a man named Albert Brown, who was from Springfield, Massachusetts. and I think they might have been childhood friends. The partnership was based in the Tenderloin district of Manhattan, which is kind of what we call Midtown now. And Brown only stayed for a year and then left, but Peyton stayed with the business and weathered on. And eventually he had some success. And meanwhile, his younger brother also eventually went to Yale. But by 1903, Peyton had been able to get buildings from white building owners, and they asked him to manage them. He began to position himself as a specialist in colored tenements, as he called it. And the appeal for white owners at that time was Black people were charged higher rents than white tenants because their choices were limited. And so Peyton was able to get management contracts. By 1903, he bought this building in the center of this picture. And this is on 131st Street between Lenox and Fifth Avenue, 15 West 131st Street, and it still exists and looks pretty much like that. This photograph and this page is from a book called The Negro in Business that came out in 1907. And so Peyton is on the left, and then his wife, Maggie, is on the right. And so Peyton was beginning to succeed. In 1903, he also formed a partnership that he called the AfroAmerican Realty Company. He joined with about 10 entrepreneurs, Black entrepreneurs in New York, to form this partnership. And most of them were older than him. He's in his 20s at this point, and he continues to his real estate management operations then. The next year in 1904, there is an event that positions him on the trajectory that he'll be on for the rest of his life. In Harlem, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, if you know Harlem, the area where Harlem Hospital is at 135th and Lenox Avenue, the south side of 135th Street, and where Lenox Terrace is now, there would have been 134th and 133rd Street. Those streets between Lenox and Fifth Avenue had been a Black enclave, at least from the 1890s. And again, the appeal of attracting Black tenants, when most of Harlem at this time is predominantly white, middle and upper middle class, those three streets were not, they were Black. And there were some white people who lived on the streets as well. In 1904, a larger white real estate firm had begun to purchase property in that area. And there were vacant, the land where Harlem Hospital is now on the north side of 135th Street was vacant. They purchased that land, and then they purchased some buildings on the south side of 135th Street. And in 1904, they served eviction notices on many of the people in the occupied buildings that they had purchased. And this map is showing that area. It was called Little Africa on maps. And so they served the eviction notice. The residents organize, and they catch the attention of Black investors. And there's a counter movement where the Black investors, including Philip Payton and some of his other colleagues, begin buying property, almost like a chess game, to block the movement of this eviction. I haven't been able to determine if the eviction went through, but what we do know is that the Black investors bought enough property to block Hudson Realty, and eventually Hudson Realty sells all the properties they had purchased. This event brings Peyton to the national attention, particularly the attention of Booker T. Washington. Peyton Washington is congratulating Peyton. He already knew Peyton by this time because through several relationships, Peyton had become involved with the National Negro Business League, which was one of the main venues that Washington used to understand what was going on in the nation and to cultivate relationships with Black entrepreneurs. And so he congratulates Peyton. Peyton also had other prominent friends. Emmett Scott, who was Washington's right-hand man, was a very good friend of Peyton's. He was also an investor in the company. Charles W. Anderson, who was a important part of the machine of Washington, was also good friends with Peyton. Later in 1904, Peyton incorporates the AfroAmerican Realty Company and expands its work beyond just leasing properties, but developing, but also they begin selling shares at $10 a share. And they continue the notion of colored tenements. That's what's in their advertisement. And this eventually leads to a backlash. White residents of Harlem begin putting in place restrictive covenants, and this is showing a list of some of those covenants from 1907 to 1910, the areas where that was placed. And this image is showing there was a pivotal legal case challenging whether they were legal or not, and it ended up being dismissed. And I follow up this in my previous book, Race and Real Estate, which came out in 2015. Peyton, from 1904 until 1917, is going through a lot of ups and downs. In 1917, his biggest deal is announced, and it was for over 100 units of housing on 2 streets. He was going to be leasing these buildings, and this is from the New York Age in the summer of 1917. By the time that deal is announced, Peyton was already quite sick with liver cancer, even though most people didn't know that. And at the end of August of 1917, he dies. And this is the New York Age article about his burial. He was buried in Westfield, Massachusetts. This is the family gravesite. And but the eulogists called him the father of colored Harlem when he died. And when we look at why they would have called him that, it's because he facilitated the movement of large numbers of Black people. And I think I'm fairly certain that he paves the way for Harlem to be a large Black community that is able to inspire and really be the base of what we now call the Harlem Renaissance. So I will stop there. I'll be glad to answer any questions you have. And I know there's some in the chat, but if you want to unmute for questions as well, you may. Are there other questions? Any questions or comments?
Yes, this is Juanita from James William Johnson in Jacksonville. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you? Welcome.
Good, good. I'd like to know, did you do any following of his children, Peyton's children?
He didn't have children of his own. He raised his niece and nephew, Bessie and Duke Hobby, who were the son and daughter of his wife, Maggie's sister. Maggie died. She lived in North Carolina, and her husband continued to be in North Carolina, but for some reason the children were sent to live with Peyton and Maggie, and he raised them. And so I've been in touch with, Bessie Hobby died in the 1950s. Duke died in the 1970s. I've been in touch with Bessie Hobby's grandson, who lives outside of Philadelphia. His brothers they both died young. James died in 1902 from typhoid fever, and Edward died in 1912 from tuberculosis, and neither of them had children. And so there were no direct descendants of Peyton. And if we look at his father's level, Philip Peyton Sr., there are relatives there, but I hadn't been able to get in touch with them. Are there other questions?
Thank you.
Mhm. I mean, one thing I didn't mention is that one of the things that attracted me to this book is, so in the prospectus, Peyton says that he is going to, I'll just read it. He says, the idea that Negroes must be confined to certain localities can be done away with. The idea that it is not practical to put colored and white tenants together in the same house can be done away with. And he's really saying he's going to eradicate racial discrimination in housing. But what I was describing is what he actually did. And really what he did is reinforce the segregation practices. In some cases, he bought white buildings occupied by white people, evicted the white people, and put in Black people. And he also charged Black people higher rents as well. And so by 1913, he's being criticized, he and other Black brokers, because by that time there are other Black real estate companies. They're all being criticized by their Black tenants, saying that they're doing the same thing that white property owners were doing. Are there other questions?
Yes, Dr. McGruder, what happened to his real estate company after he died?
He had a sister, Susan, who was a year older than him. And Susan's husband, William Wortham, managed that company at least until the 40s. Susan and William Wortham, they both died in the late 1950s. And I spent a long time trying to identify records, and I have not been able to. But I think if they do exist, and I even tried to find, and William Wortham and Susan didn't have children either. I tried to find relatives on the Wortham side and haven't been able to. But I think if records exist, that's probably where they are. Peyton and Maggie were separated at his death. And so Bessie's grandson knew very little about kind of what would have happened to, he didn't know anything about what could have happened to the records. But the company continued to go on at least until the 40s.
What about the wealth that he amassed? Was that divided among the rest of the family? Did it go to a corporation?
Yes, his will divided it between his niece, his nephew, and some to Maggie. What I could not determine was exactly what the wealth was, because the inventory that should be in the public records, the file is empty. And so he definitely had the building. Maggie continued to live in the building into the 20s. And then she sold the building and moved. His death definitely meant her status changed. That by I believe it's the 50s, she's working, she owns a home in Rockland County, New York. She's working as a laundress, and I don't know, well, just that, and that was a common occupation for Black women, and that's very different from the way she was living when he was alive, because there's an article in a white newspaper from the Northwest that's describing how her car drops her off in front of a department store, and she went in and bought luxury items just using his name. And so there was wealth at that time. He's struggling by the time of his death, though. He's really trying to find the next thing. In 1907, he's sued by some of his shareholders because he hadn't issued a dividend, and that tarnished his reputation. And so from then until the next 10 years, he's really working his way back. He forms the Philip A. Payton Company, and that's the company that continues through the 40s. AfroAmerican Realty just disappears. And so he is in the public eye. He's doing things, but I haven't been able to determine just the extent of the wealth, but it wasn't so extensive that his niece and nephew, they lived middle-class lives, but it wasn't a life of great wealth, which is a common story for African Americans in terms of being able to transfer wealth to that next generation.
Was there any indication that he was involved in any philanthropic efforts? His being praised by Booker T. Washington
Yes,
may have
yes.
pointed in that direction.
Yes, he was. He supported different causes. There's a lot of newspaper articles that talk about him involved with fundraisers. He did not go to Tuskegee, but he had close ties with Tuskegee.